Hi, my name is Andrew Gunawella. Welcome to the Burn Bag Podcast. Today, the news has been dominated by the news about tariffs. Your markets have been dominated by tariffs. Your wallets have been dominated by tariffs. So much of what we're paying attention to are tariffs. It's what I've been focusing on in my job. And we haven't done an episode on President Trump's tariffs yet, but I have a really great opportunity to interview Mark Linscott here today, who will be able to talk a little bit about that. So, Mark Linscott served as the Assistant U.S. Trade Representative in three of the most influential positions at USTR over a 30-year career. He led U.S. trade policy for South and Central Asia, coordinated America's strategy at the WTO, and oversaw global negotiations on trade and the environment. Mark played a key role in shaping trade agreements, major agreements, from the U.S.-India Trade Policy Forum to the WTO's Trade Facilitation Agreement, and represented the U.S. in top-tier forums like the G20, the OECD, and APEC. Mark joins us to unpack the logic, leverage, and impact of President Trump's tariffs in today's shifting trade landscape. So, Mark, thanks for joining me here today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Andre. It's a pleasure.
So, Mark, I sort of want to frame this episode as sort of tariffs for dummies. I mean, a lot of people have heard about tariffs in the news, but they may not necessarily know how it exactly works. So for listeners who are less familiar with trade policy, could you explain what exactly tariffs are and sort of how they function in international trade?
Sure. In the most basic terms, tariffs are, well, one, government imposed, a mandatory requirement that there be a payment associated with imports. I mean, there can be trade restrictions and tariffs on exports as well, but generally we think of tariffs on the import side. They are normally paid by importers of a product. They apply to goods. They do not apply to services. And generally, tariffs are calculated on the basis of a percentage of the value of a product that's coming across borders, that's being imported into a jurisdiction. There are exceptions to that. For example, for many years in sensitive agriculture sectors, a lot of countries applied specific duties. It would be a certain value associated with a certain volume of imports, as opposed to a calculation of a percentage of the value of a shipment. But it's normally ad valorem, a percentage of the value of a shipment. And tariffs have been around forever. I mean, tariffs go back centuries, and all countries and empires and kingdoms have applied tariffs in the past. In fact, I've long been a fan of reading about the Plantagenet kings in Britain, and I'm now reading a biography of Edward III, and of course, tariffs feature prominently in much of the history of that realm. So, they've been around for a long time. And, it's part of everyday life, actually.
So, I mean, what legal mechanisms does the U.S. president have to actually impose tariffs? Because, I mean, when we're talking about this latest round or rounds of tariffs in the plural, we're often referring to it as President Trump's tariffs on this country, on the world, etc.
Well, in the United States, and I'm no legal expert, but I think I know enough to at least be a bit dangerous on some of these questions. In the United States, it's the Congress that has authority over trade and over tariffs. But for decades, the Congress has delegated authority periodically to the executive branch, to the president, to apply tariffs. We've got plenty of pieces of legislation that remain in place. And those are the authorities that President Trump has been using to invoke his new tariffs and to justify those. So in many respects, it's an issue of the Congress giving up its power to the executive branch with some trust in the responsibility of the executive branch to use that power wisely. And for the moment, we're not really seeing pushback on the tariffs in the Congress. Certainly for the party in the majority.
Can you tell us a little bit more about some of these powers the president actually has to impose tariffs? I mean, I think recently we've been hearing about the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, otherwise known as IEPA. We've been also been hearing a little bit about Section 232. Can you tell us a little bit more about those powers and I guess why the usage of those powers may be a little bit more unique in the current context?
Sure. Well, why don't I start by citing a legislative authority that you did not mention, even though it's well known. It's been used a lot in fact, over the last now three administrations. That's Section 301. Section 301 is an authority to the president, but delegated to the U.S. Trade Representative to investigate foreign unfair trade practices. And after reaching a conclusion that, in fact, there has been an unfair trade practice, USTR has the authority to apply tariffs, and that's been around since the 1970s. Was again used during the first Trump administration against China. Those tariffs under 301 were maintained by the Biden administration and remain in force now. Now, Section 232, that's also been around for a long time. That's, I think, the 1962 Trade Act. It relates to investigations of imports related to concerns about national security. Situations in which a value or volume of imports affects domestic capacity to the point of raising national security concerns. It's been used very sparingly since the early 60s, but picked up speed during the first Trump administration with tariffs on steel and aluminum. Again, tariffs that remain in force and were maintained by the Biden administration, and these were essentially invoked after investigation by the Commerce Department. It's the Commerce Department that has authority to do those investigations. Now we're seeing 232 being used again on autos. In fact, there was an investigation during the first Trump administration. Now tariffs have been applied, and we have new 232 investigations that have been opened up: pharmaceuticals, semiconductors. In fact, this morning, an announcement on trucks that kind of came out of the blue.
Oh, gee.
Yeah. So I wasn't expecting that. IEPA, then, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977. In fact, this is a statute that I understand was put into place to put some constraints on the presidency. In fact, after President Nixon in 1972 did an across-the-board tariff of 10% for several months, and there had been essentially no procedures associated with that. So when Congress passed IEPA in 1977, it's been used quite a lot to restrict trade with real enemies, those that pose real risks to global security. It's only been in this administration and Trump 2.0 that IEPA has been used to, in fact, apply tariffs and apply tariffs broadly against enemy and ally alike. And the unique thing about IEPA, despite the fact that it was legislated to provide some kind of constraint on the executive branch, it essentially doesn't have any procedures. So it can be invoked and tariffs applied immediately, or at least that's what this administration has done. Now, there are pending lawsuits already on the use of IEPA during this administration. I expect over time we will have court rulings that determine whether or not the administration has been within the requirements of IEPA. But it's been used it's kind of a quick and dirty approach to apply tariffs without there really being any opportunity for public comment, consultation with the Congress, any process whatsoever.
And that's super interesting. And I mean, I think even when you mentioned Section 232, sort of the national security, I think justifications for the imposition of tariffs, you mentioned that I believe the Biden administration actually maintained some of those tariffs that were justified with Section 232. Does that at all denote like a change in terms of how we sort of talk about tariffs that's in a bipartisan nature, right? Like, are we seeing more and more national security justifications for tariffs sort of across the board? And do you sort of foresee this as being the overarching trend, like, say, 10 years down the line, for example?
Yeah, it's very hard to predict 2 weeks down the line,
Yeah.
let alone 10 years down the line. But I think the fact that the Biden administration maintained those tariffs on steel and aluminum that were applied as a national security emergency by the first Trump administration does suggest some bipartisan support for, one, that justification, and two, use of that statute and applying tariffs broadly. And, at the time in the first Trump administration, the real target had been China. I mean, that's what
Yeah.
China had very dominant overcapacity in the steel sector, and globally, many countries were suffering as a result. When that action was taken, I think I was in the government at the time at the U.S. Trade Representative's office. I think most of us expected these would be tariffs applied to China only. In fact, they were applied across the board to everyone, which was a big surprise, with only a few exceptions. And again, those tariffs were maintained by the Biden administration. So, that does seem to suggest at least that there's comfort in the United States with invoking national security to raise tariffs and to do that broadly against allies as well.
So when we talk about the actual strategy behind tariffs, some in the administration have talked about this as sort of a way to generate revenue. President Trump, I believe, has talked about tariffs being used to make America the richest country in the planet. What strategic purposes do tariffs actually serve in modern trade policy? Is it just for revenue generation? Is it to protect industries? How have they been leveraged in the past?
Yeah, I think it's been a long time since revenue was the central objective. Raising revenue was the central objective behind tariffs and the U.S. tariff regime. Certainly early in the history of the Federal Republic, tariffs were the main source of revenue for the federal government, but that's not been the case for a long time because now we have taxes, and particularly the income tax. That is a much more important source of revenue. But as you know, there are other public policy objectives that can be pursued using tariffs. One is certainly protectionism, and around the globe, a lot of countries apply tariffs to protect its domestic market for domestic production. Whether ultimately it's effective or not is an open question that economists can argue about. But protection is certainly a motivation for tariffs. And then there's, to some extent, there's leverage. And I referenced, for example, 301, Section 301, and that is a statute that looks at unfair trade practices, provides the authority to respond with tariffs. And in many respects, the tariffs that are applied are leverage to try to convince a foreign trading partner to change its ways, to eliminate the target unfair trade practices that it has used. So, there is that, in a sense, that reciprocal leveraging objective that can be central to the use of tariffs.
So, I mean, speaking of reciprocal, I mean, President Trump declared April 2nd, 2025 as sort of Liberation Day, right? He introduced that 10% universal tariff and higher, quote, reciprocal tariffs on countries, really with significant trade deficits with the United States. What are your thoughts on President Trump's approach with these Liberation Day tariffs?
Well, once again, there was the element of surprise. I mean, he had forecast his plan to use tariffs and to broadly apply tariffs during the campaign. We had the experience during the first administration, so I expect none of us should have been surprised yet. the the announcement was made on April 2nd. I think many of us, certainly many of us trade experts who have spent careers working on trade, were nonetheless surprised at its scope, particularly the 10% part of it.
Yeah.
You know, the universal tariff. The universal tariff and 10% is substantial. I mean, historically, I mean, over the last couple of decades, the U.S. simple average tariff rate has been between 2 to 3%. So to apply a tariff across the board to all products at 10% on top of that 2 to 3% is, I mean, it's huge. It's substantial. And by applying to countries that, in fact, some countries that have lower simple average tariffs than the United States, you know, it's hard to understand why that was done. There aren't many countries like that, but there are a few, and the 10% applies to them. The 10% applies to countries with which the United States has a trade surplus. That country has a trade deficit with us, yet the 10% applies to them as well. So that was really hard to understand. Now, the reciprocal part, in which targets some individual countries, although 60 to 70 countries, that seems more focused on others having higher tariffs and that being unfair and creating an unlevel playing field. But you know, that again, that's on top of the universal tariff. Yeah, in the end, this was huge. I mean, this was unprecedented. In the modern age of trade, meaning going back to World War II, we've seen nothing like this. So it's historic. I mean, there's I think no other better word to explain what we saw on April 2nd.
So, I mean, at the announcement on April 2nd, President Trump held up the big board with all of the the numbers, basically, the tariff rates by which he would put tariffs on all of these countries and so on. And a lot of people had questions about the actual numbers. What do you make of the administration's methodology in determining these tariff rates, the formula that they have used to calculate these reciprocal tariffs? That they said was really based on these trade deficits. I mean, how solid, I guess, was the methodology, the formula?
Well, plenty of economists and trade experts have criticized the formula. It was again the element of surprise. And it was truly shocking. I think most of us anticipated, given what we had heard from the administration in its first couple of months and even during the campaign, that the reciprocal tariffs would be calculated on the basis of the differential between high tariffs in another country and low tariffs in the United States, which is a pretty straightforward calculation. If India has a simple average tariff of 17%, ours is roughly 3%, that's a 14% differential. So might there then be a 14% reciprocal tariff applied? The added kind of complication associated with this was the criticism of other countries' non-tariff barriers. Yeah. A lot of countries have, including the United States, has, you know, a variety of non-tariff barriers. So I think many of us were anticipating, I think some in the administration were anticipating this as well, that there would be some kind of quantitative calculation of the tariff equivalent for non-tariff barriers. So that could be added to the tariff differential, and then you come up with the reciprocal tariff. In fact, that was not the methodology used. It was strictly based on a trade deficit with a country, and the proportion of trade deficit versus the value or the percentage of the value of that country's exports to the United States. So it seemed to have nothing to do with a calculation of the unfair portion of the relationship. The higher tariffs in a country, the higher non-tariff barriers. It was all about the trade deficit. And deficits, there are a lot of factors that go into trade deficits. It's not simply unfair trade practices. There are imbalances in current accounts that lead to deficits. There are imbalances between saving and spending that lead to deficits. It's not simply what's happening on the ground in terms of unfair trade. So this was certainly a surprise as well.
Is a trade deficit necessarily bad?
Well, I mean, we're venturing a bit into an area where I would leave it to hardcore economists, and I'm certainly not a hardcore economist. As a trade policy and trade negotiator practitioner. But I think a lot of economists would say, deficits, there are always going to be deficits with some countries and surpluses with other countries. A lot of it does depend on balances or imbalances between saving and spending, and that generally they are not, or they're not always a negative thing. Obviously, the United States has historic levels of trade deficits, and maybe that's a different consideration. But in itself, I don't know that a trade deficit with a certain country, particularly if it's a small trade deficit, is a bad thing. And we run trade surpluses with countries, so is that a bad thing? I mean, it's it should apply equally to us as well.
So President Trump paused the tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs, for 90 days, I think, while still maintaining the 10% universal. However, the tariffs on China have escalated to as high as, I believe, 145%. What do you make of, with the raises in the tariff rates I really saw was a tit for tat between the US and China. The US was raising tariffs, China then retaliated and raised tariffs, and now we're at 145. What do you make of this 145% number? What are the implications of it? Do you think it will stand?
Well, it's a very high tariff to be applied across the board. Now we have the exceptions in the electronics sector, and we'll see how long they stand. But it's a very high tariff, which means that a lot of trade is going to stop between the United States and China. And that then begs the question, is this much more than de-risking? Is it true decoupling? Is now decoupling foreseeable? Is it, is it the objective? That has huge implications in terms of, I think the global economy and impacts on the global economy. So, in the first Trump administration, there was initial talk of decoupling. There was some backpedaling, and I think even my old boss, Bob Lighthizer, had at one point in time suggested that decoupling is, really isn't possible. And that the term being used certainly during the Biden administration was de-risking. Now we have the question of decoupling. However, in the last 24 hours, we've got the president saying, well, we're ready to negotiate. So, we could have a different scenario weeks from now or months from now in which those tariffs are at least not as high as they are currently.
So, how have US allies, how have US trading partners actually responded to these sweeping tariffs? Are we witnessing a new era of trade wars, or are we seeing more conciliatory measures taking place?
Well, many of them, I think most of them have um, have reacted with a high degree of anxiety. This is a high anxiety moment for many of these countries. The U.S. economy is the largest in the world. It matters to them, um, and there's a lot of concern about the impacts on their trade with the United States, and again, what that means for the global economy. Does this risk moving into a global recession? So that's been, I think, a universal response. However, there are some, particularly those who I think feel that this was really unforeseen and hard to understand, like Canada, have responded by retaliating, to not simply stand by and take the hit and not respond. I mean, the EU is in the process of retaliating as well, although there are, I think, a lot of debates among European leaders on exactly what to do. So there are those who respond with retaliatory tariffs. And then there are plenty of others who are taking more of a wait and see attitude. I mean, they're not sitting on their hands, but they calculate that, in fact, these tariffs are being used by the Trump administration as leverage to negotiate with them, for the United States to negotiate with them to lower their tariffs and to eliminate their highly prejudicial non-tariff barriers. And I will be very frank. There are a lot of countries out there that have a lot higher tariff rates than the United States, and it has seemed like nothing works in terms of convincing those countries to lower their tariffs. I mean, there were efforts in the WTO for decades to have successes in convincing other countries to lower their tariff rates, and those efforts failed. So many countries are saying now, okay, uncle, we'll talk to you, we'll negotiate with you, we'll lower our tariffs. So in that sense, the tariffs have been, at least in the short term, effective in getting some of these countries the belly up to the table and get serious about their own trade practices and finding opportunities to negotiate more balance in the relationships. We'll see what comes of them. It's hard to imagine negotiations with a dozen even, but or more, 20, 30, 40 countries simultaneously, how that can be done. Negotiations are resource intensive. They take time. It requires expertise, both negotiating expertise and trade expertise. So how those can be done quickly is a big question mark. But I think many are willing to make the effort. I think India has been particularly savvy.
Yeah.
Prime Minister Modi has been, I think, remarkably smart in coming to Washington even before Liberation Day, agreeing to negotiate a comprehensive bilateral trade agreement. Minister Goyal has been here, talking to his counterparts, particularly Jameson Greer, the U.S. Trade Representative. On Liberation Day, so-called Liberation Day, when the tariffs were announced, the Indian government issued a statement that was short and remarkably neutral, restrained. And I think that was the way to go about doing it. And in fact, there's a team here this week negotiating, and it seems to be a very serious intent to be successful in those negotiations. I think that was a good way, certainly for the likes of India, to approach this.
And can you tell us a little bit more about the US India trade context? Because when people think of protectionist countries, I feel like India comes to mind in terms of how they want to protect their industries and so on. So, like, would India have sort of fit into the bill of, say, some of those countries you mentioned earlier that really have those high barriers up that it was really difficult to convince them to bring them down for the US? Or am I misleading a little bit here?
No, I mean that's definitely the case. I mean, there are all kinds of assessments on the declining relevancy of the WTO for decades. You know, when I started off in trade, when I was a youngster in trade, and this goes back 3+ decades, the multilateral trading system first established right after World War II in 1947. I mean, that was trade. I mean, that was trade policy, that was trade negotiation, doing it in Geneva, doing it first in the GATT, and then since 1995 in the WTO. However, um, the last big round of trade negotiations, that's historically how trade negotiations have taken place, rounds that can go on for anywhere from 3 to 4 years to 7 or 8 years. The last round, the Doha round, at least from a US perspective, largely failed or collapsed because some of the major developing countries, and India was big time implicated in this, not being ready to negotiate reductions in its tariffs. When the United States tariff was an average of 3.3%, India, wasn't, there was just no traction in getting India to negotiate on its tariffs. And that was hugely frustrating. I was the assistant USTR for WTO at the very end of that, and by that time the negotiations had collapsed, and there was just, and it was hard to understand what could be achieved in this round of negotiation as a result. And to some extent, in very, I think, indirect ways, it's never been clearly stated by the administration, but I think is a root of many of the grievances that are being expressed about unfair tariff levels or imbalance in tariff levels, is the failure in the WTO to fix that, to resolve those issues of differential tariff rates.
So, aside from India, because it feels like India certainly very far along in terms of their negotiation strategy with the United States, as you said, India's really played it very smart. What are some other countries that have made progress on some of these negotiations that we're seeing that you think are sort of ahead of the curve on these?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, those that the big ones, Japan, Korea, obviously India, Vietnam, I think the European Union. They are the attention is being devoted to them initially for trade negotiations to see if some deals can be struck during this 90-day reprieve, that might lead to a situation in which there are further suspensions or even lifting of the threat of reciprocal tariffs with those individual countries. If you're far down the list, you're relatively small. It may take some time for the U.S. to get to those countries. I don't think any country is very far along yet.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. and India got an early start. I think India's front of the line, but also the U.S. and India's aspiration, agreed when Prime Minister Modi was here in February, is for a very large comprehensive agreement. It's not being characterized as an FTA, free trade agreement. Legally, it's not a free trade agreement, but in substance, it could look a lot like an FTA. With the likes of a Japan, with Vietnam, it may not go so deep. It may strictly be tariffs and priority non-tariff barriers, but those negotiations will still take time. So I just think it's too early to say, what kind of progress has been made. What is prospect for deals within this 90-day period?
Do you think that the administration's thinking, and this is sort of asking you, sort of to be honest, look into the crystal ball, but do you think the administration's thinking on tariffs has changed as a result of sort of like the market responses coupled with like sort of the massive amount of negotiations that are trying to be initiated right now? Or do you think that the strategy has been somewhat consistent?
I think the my sense is that the objectives remain largely unchanged. And one objective being there are a lot of countries out there with a lot of trade barriers, and that needs to get fixed. And efforts in previous administrations to do that, simply didn't work. And these tariffs are much about getting a more level playing field in trade. So I think that remains a central objective. I think another central objective, which is a little more difficult to predict how these tariffs will make a difference, is the trade deficits. And that the administration's been clear. Many individuals in the administration have been clear that trade deficits have to go down. So I think that remains a central objective as well. But day by day, we've seen adjustments, we've seen new exceptions, we've seen the 90-day reprieve itself, and we've seen at least the start of negotiations. So I don't know if it's been a shift as opposed to an evolving policy. Whereas in the first month or two, it was simply action, 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 without there being a clear strategy, at least articulated, on how to go about doing this. Now we are seeing announcement that suggests that at least there's some strategizing going on and some evolution in the approach. So yes, I mean there have been shifts, and there's no doubt about that, day by day. But whether the policy objectives have changed substantially, I don't think that's the case.
So the IMF has downgraded global growth forecasts, with US tariff policies being a significant factor. I mean, when we're talking about the global implications of these tariffs in an economic sense, there are a lot of fears of that global recession. What do you think are the actual effects?
Yeah, again, Andre, you're venturing into the realm of economics and what the economists assess, and I'm wary about saying much, but I certainly read what many leading economists say, including the IMF. I mean, the IMF has adjusted its expectations for global growth downwards, and many institutions and economists are suggesting that the risks of global recession are increasing. So, I think that is something everyone needs to be aware of and kind of consider the implications of that. Trade is definitely going to at least temporarily change. I mean, it's going to decline in relative terms compared to the trend lines. That's definitely going to happen. Over time, does it mean that the United States is trading less and our trading partners are trading more among themselves? I guess that there's that scenario, but we got a long ways to go before we're at that point.
So, I mean, if there's a change in the administration in the future, I mean, how challenging would it be to actually reverse some of these tariffs should they remain for the duration of President Trump's term? Like, can the next president, say a Democrat, just with the stroke of a pen, just reverse all of this?
Yeah. Well, I think we can all expect there will be a change in administration. We've got a 4-year term, and at the end of that 4-year term, there's the next administration. I mean, legally, yes. So your scenario, a next president being, or next administration being Democratic. Legally, sure, there is, that tariffs can be adjusted, can be scrapped without too much difficulty. It wouldn't, unless Congress passes new legislation that has new requirements associated with tariffs. There's not much preventing legally, I think, a future administration from changing the approach on tariffs. But once tariffs are in place and beneficiary industries have had a protected market for a period of time, politically it can be very difficult to make adjustments. And I think we've seen that with the steel and aluminum industries. The Biden administration, probably for very good reasons, decided not to lift the steel and aluminum tariffs. Politically, I think it would have been very difficult and would have alienated many of its constituencies. So, that's a big question mark. What are the political costs associated with changing the approach on tariffs? That said, this is a huge experiment. We don't know where it's going to go with these new tariffs. And if it doesn't go well, there may be many constituencies clamoring for some big changes, and that could have an impact.
So when we talk about this being a huge experiment, a lot of folks have used the term unprecedented in describing President Trump's tariff actions. However, is there some precedent for some of these wide-ranging tariffs, like maybe a century ago, for example? Like, where can we look to history to sort of make sense of this and to potentially observe possible implications?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is unprecedented. And I noted this before, in the modern age of trade, meaning since World War II, since 1947, 1947 being the moment when a multilateral trading system, an MTS, was established under the GATT, the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade. So this is what has happened now is not like no other moment since 1947. There are some echoes in the period of the late 1920s and the 1930s of countries raising tariffs, negotiating bilaterally, striking bilateral deals. I mean, we've got the very well-known Smoot-Hawley Act of 1930 in the United States, in which tariffs were raised substantially. The United States was not the only one to raise its tariffs. For example, I recently read that the first country to do that was Germany. In fact, Germany had been restricted under the Treaty of Versailles coming out of World War I. Had been restricted in having a trade policy, having a tariff policy. I mean, the Allies had prevented that from happening, but that expired. Those restrictions expired in the late 1920s, and Germany immediately raised its tariffs. So, that's basically what we experienced between the world wars. It didn't end well. It didn't go well. One big difference was that preceding that, there was no multilateral trading system. There was no GATT. There was no WTO. So it is a different circumstance. And, at some point in time now, and looking ahead, even if we have trade wars, might there be a credible effort to kind of go back to a multilateral trading system, whether it's a reformed WTO, a more relevant WTO, which doesn't seem likely right now, or something completely new. I think it will be important to watch that space. I think we are now in a moment of it being bilateral, being potentially regional, and what happens in Geneva is not highly relevant at all. where will we be 3 or 4 years from now? It's still too soon to predict, I think.
So my last question to round us out, how do you view the US's position as a global trade leader? Do you see it changing significantly with all of these tariffs?
Yeah, I mean, again, when I first became a trade official, um, and was negotiating with other countries, and a lot of that being in Geneva. I mean, that again, the GATT and then the WTO, that's where the action was. In the early part of my career, late 80s, 90s, mid 90s, that's where the action was. And everyone looked to, and China was not in the system at that point in time. Russia was not in the system at that point in time. Everyone looked to the United States for leadership, even the Europeans. And in many respects, the EU and the United States did not see eye to eye.
Hmm.
We all did battle, but it's pretty clear, at least to us, that the Europeans could not lead like the United States could lead. I mean, the United States was the architect for the multilateral trading system. And even while other countries would complain about us, and the expectations were always a bit unrealistic that we would lead, yet we wouldn't have our own national interests to defend and protect, I think was unrealistic. But that's kind of how it operated. And I'm sure I'd have former foreign colleagues who would say, "Oh no, it wasn't that way." But that's certainly my perspective. It was. U.S. leadership was central to the relevancy of the of the system, and now it is widely seen, rightly or wrongly, because I think these issues with the WTO go back well before the first Trump administration. This wasn't a completely new phenomenon in 2017. There were years of decline before that, but I with unilateral actions, with justifications based on national security, even during the Biden administration, and the United States not being alone, but during the Biden administration, having legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, that had domestic content requirements that raised some real issues about consistency with the WTO. So I think that impacted perceptions of U.S. leadership as well. But certainly now the fast-paced, unexpected, surprise unilateral actions has created a lot of misgivings, and I think has attenuated the trust that a lot of countries had in the United States as a the anchor, the foundation of the system that's been in place since World War II. So, I think it does impact U.S. leadership. And the fact that we've taken action that applies to strong allies, important allies, even when they run trade deficits with us, even when their tariffs are lower than ours, creates a, it doesn't contribute to perceptions of, the U.S. as a trusted partner.
Mark, on that note, thank you so much for joining me here today. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate you sort of running us through sort of tariffs, how they work, how the administration has been imposing them, and sort of all the reactions that we've been seeing, especially for so many folks who are, in the field, in public policy, in foreign policy, who maybe don't really have that sort of insight, that type of information sort of on how tariffs work. So this has been really educational.
Great. Thanks, Andre. It's been a real pleasure.